China has asked Russia to postpone the Ukraine war until after the Olympics. According to a Western intelligence report, Chinese authorities had some level of direct awareness of President Vladimir Putin's military preparations or intentions. Senior Chinese authorities warned senior Russian officials in early February not to attack Ukraine before the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. Senior Chinese officials had some level of first-hand awareness of Russia's military preparations or intentions before the assault began last week. On the eve of the Olympics, Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing on February 4. At the time, Moscow and Beijing published a 5,000-word declaration stating that their alliance had no bounds, opposing NATO enlargement, and declaring that they would construct a new world order based on real democracy. The intelligence gathered during the meeting between Chinese and Russian officials was classified. It was gathered by a Western intelligence agency and was deemed reliable by authorities. It was shared around among senior officials in the United States and its allies as they considered when Mr. Putin could invade Ukraine. However, various intelligence services interpreted the material differently, and it is unclear how broadly the information was transmitted. According to one individual familiar with the information, the evidence does not necessarily imply that discussions regarding an invasion occurred at the level of Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin. Other officials informed on the intelligence declined to comment. Because of the sensitive nature of the intelligence, the officials spoke about the findings on the condition of anonymity. When asked by email on Wednesday whether Chinese officials had urged Russian officials to postpone an invasion of Ukraine until after the Olympics, Liu Pengyu, the Chinese embassy's spokesman in Washington, said, "These claims are speculation without any basis, and are intended to blame, shift and smear China." On February 20th, China hosted the Olympics closing ceremony. Mr. Putin ordered additional Russian forces to invade an insurgent-controlled area of eastern Ukraine the next day, after state television televised a meeting between him and his National Security Council, as well as an angry speech in which he claimed Ukraine should be a part of Russia. On February 24th, the Russian military launched a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, including strikes on cities with ballistic missiles, artillery, and tanks. Officials in the United States and Europe have said they find it difficult to believe Mr. Putin's invasion began so soon after the Olympics. Russia invaded Georgia during the Summer Olympics in Beijing in August 2008, which enraged some Chinese leaders. To preparation for the invasion, Russia shifted military forces from its border with China and other regions of the east to Ukraine and Belarus this winter. The actions demonstrated a high level of confidence between Russian and Chinese authorities. For years, China and Russia have been increasing their economic, political, and military relations. Before their most recent conclave in Beijing, Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin met 37 times as national leaders. The ambitious joint statement made by the two countries during that meeting concerned American and European officials, particularly because it was the first time China has clearly sided with Russia on NATO and European security problems. Since then, European politicians have condemned China and Russia. Representative Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin and a member of the House Intelligence Committee, said he was not aware with intelligence on Russian-Chinese talks over Ukraine, but Beijing's backing for Moscow was evident. The Chinese endorsed Putin's entire narrative that the West provoked Russia, Mr. Gallagher said. "I perceive no shift in Chinese attitudes toward Russia. At the moment, they are in a de facto coalition against the West. For months, some American officials attempted to seek China's assistance in averting the war." Days after President Biden talked with Mr. Xi via video conference on November 15, senior American officials agreed to provide intelligence about Russia's force buildup surrounding Ukraine to senior Chinese officials in an attempt to urge Mr. Putin to back down. The Americans spoke with Qin Gang, China's ambassador in Washington, as well as Wang Yi, China's foreign minister. According to American sources, Chinese officials voiced pessimism that Mr. Putin would attack Ukraine in a half-dozen conversations, including one in Washington between U.S. officials and the Chinese ambassador only hours before the Russian invasion. Following a diplomatic interaction in December, American authorities got intelligence indicating that Beijing had shared the material with Moscow, informing the Russians that the U.S. was attempting to foment dissension and that China would not obstruct Russian intentions, according to American sources. In general, U.S. intelligence findings and assessments of Russian intentions for an invasion of Ukraine have been correct. Last October, the U.S. launched a campaign to share intelligence with mostly friend and partner nations, as well as to make declassified data available to the public, in order to put pressure on Russia to prevent any planned invasion. The CIA director, William J. Burns, traveled to Moscow on November 2 to face the Russians with the material, and on November 17, American intelligence officers briefed NATO on their findings. According to many sources informed on London's intelligence, British authorities believe that an assault by Mr. Putin before the Olympics was feasible but improbable. That was partially based on the Western intelligence report, but primarily on an analytic judgment that Russia's strategy to circumvent Western sanctions was heavily reliant on Chinese help, as well as the assumption that Mr. Putin would not risk enraging Mr. Xi. According to people familiar with British thinking, British officials also assessed that the joint statement issued by Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi was a clear sign of China's support, something Beijing would have been reluctant to give if Mr. Putin was willing to overshadow the Olympics by beginning his assault before the end of the Games. Around February 10, American intelligence agencies witnessed Moscow making final preparations, the type of activity that immediately before an attack. Intercepted communications revealed that senior Russian commanders were being brought together for a conference, which some Western nations felt was the critical decision moment for commanders to launch the strike. This evidence was part of what prompted White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to warn on February 11 that a Russian strike may occur before the end of the Olympics. Multiple officials also stated at the time that the U.S. had received intelligence indicating that Russia was contemplating February 16 as a possible launch date for the invasion. That prognosis was proven to be off, but only by a few days. Multiple factors were considered by intelligence services in determining whether Russia could ignore China's publicly acknowledged wish for peace to be maintained during the Olympics. While U.S. officials agreed that Mr. Putin's relationship with Mr. Xi was crucial, they felt Russia intended to launch and complete an attack as soon as its forces' preparedness deteriorated. According to American sources, Mr. Putin also did not want to be perceived as being unduly submissive to another leader. According to a person informed on the assessment, both U.S. and British intelligence officers incorrectly assumed that supply difficulties that had hampered Russian soldiers in Belarus during drills had been resolved, allowing an invasion to begin. In actuality, Russian soldiers' progress into Ukraine has been hampered by supply issues. Chinese leaders have consistently sided with Russia since the war began. They have indicated sympathy for Russia's worries about NATO and have used vague terminology to describe sovereignty. Those arguments were underlined in a Chinese government readout of a phone call between Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin last Friday. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokespeople have declined to term Russia's actions an invasion, blaming the U.S. for inflaming tensions in Ukraine. China has also criticized the sanctions imposed by the United States and European countries on Russia. Wang Wenbin, a foreign ministry spokesperson, said at a press conference in Beijing on Wednesday that Russia and Ukraine should explore a political solution that meets both sides' legitimate security concerns. China is attempting to remove thousands of its residents from Ukraine, including diplomats. Before those attempts began, around 6,000 citizens were in Ukraine. According to Mr. Wang, at least one Chinese citizen was hurt by gunfire on Tuesday while attempting to flee Ukraine. According to an official Chinese interpretation, the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, met with the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, on Tuesday concerning Chinese people in the nation. It's unclear what assurances Russian officials offered Chinese authorities about the invasion, if any. Hua Chunying, a foreign ministry spokesperson, stated on February 24, the day the full-scale invasion began, "We noticed that today Russia declared the commencement of a special military operation in eastern Ukraine." Russia's defense ministry stated that no missile, air, or artillery strikes on cities would be conducted. From the start, that guarantee proved to be untrue. American and European authorities are keeping a close eye on China to see whether it will assist Russia in evading sanctions or save the Russian economy. Prior to the invasion, Beijing and Moscow struck a 30-year agreement for China to purchase gas via a new pipeline. China has recently relaxed limits on Russian wheat imports. However, U.S. officials anticipate that Chinese state-owned banks would avoid overtly breaking the sanctions for fear of harming their worldwide trade. Despite the war, athletes from Ukraine and Russia will compete in the Paralympic Winter Games, which begin on Friday in Beijing. Thank you for watching. Please like the video, share and subscribe.